Well, it's 2025. Happy cold new year. It's glad to be together in this warm place today. There's always an air of anticipation around the turn of the calendar. I hope that your eyes are fixed on the Lord for his purposes and plans for you this year and how you can follow him in it. I'm excited today, especially though, because we're diving back into our He Shall Reign series through the book of 1 Samuel. We started this back in August. It's actually going to take us all the way up until Easter, a total of 29 sermons through the book of 1 Samuel. So excited about that. If you're not already there, take your copy of God's Word, turn with me back to 1 Samuel in the Old Testament. 1 Samuel 17, you'll flip through the front of it, you'll find Joshua, then Judges, then Ruth, and then 1 Samuel chapter 17. Put a bookmark there. We'll be in that for the next couple months. Before we get into chapter 17 today, though, let's quickly review. It's been a couple weeks since we were here in this book, so let's review where we've come so far. If you remember, God's people had been freed from slavery in Egypt, and they had been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. They finally entered into the promised land. Moses led them in, and God had promised that to Abraham. He finally gave it to them, and they were to be distinct in that land, both culturally and religiously, as a way to reveal God to the world. He was their chosen people to reveal himself. He'd chosen them uniquely, and he wanted to be their God and their king in every way in their lives. Yet, as they entered the land, things continued to go bad to worse. As people rebelled against God, they failed to love God. They failed to love each other in many ways. It led to chaos in the land. And into that environment, after the book of Judges, was born a boy named Samuel, whose barren mother, Hannah, was blessed with this child and gave him back to the Lord. And he grew up to be a prophet of renewal in the nation of Israel. And during the time that he was growing up and as he was leading, God proved himself over and over again that he would deliver his people. He had not abandoned them. He would defeat their enemies on his own in miraculous ways. He showed himself to his people that he's got them. Yet still, the people became enamored with the nations around them. And instead of following Yahweh as their king, they rejected God as their king. And they instead asked for a king like everybody else around them. Now God acquiesced. He gave them what they asked for. And he appointed a tall, impressive man named Saul to be Israel's first king. Now, if you remember, the king's primary responsibility was to lead his people to follow God, to lead them into battle, yes, but to lead them to follow God's covenant responsibilities. And even though it wasn't ideal that God allowed them to have a king, that wasn't his plan to begin with. That's what he allowed, but God would still make it work if that king would follow him. Well, we saw Saul quickly reveal that his heart was not toward the Lord. So he was a mighty warrior, yes, but God ultimately rejected Saul because Saul had rejected the Lord's authority. Because God wanted a man after his own heart, a man who pursued his heart above all else. Which is why we left off in chapter 16, where that point was. We saw God reject Saul and look past the exterior and anoint a young man named David, whose heart was after God's. And so you've seen this chart before as we've walked through this journey. What we're gonna see today is that continuing shift from Saul to David. You see their paths cross, they're aligned in some ways, but it's really a comparative journey. It's gonna take us through the rest of 1 Samuel between Saul and David. They will just be contrasted the entire book. And to kick us off, in 1 Samuel again is one of the most familiar scenes in the Bible, known as David and Goliath. Now, this is one of the most well-known stories, even by people who aren't Christians. It's one of the most basic stories that people know the foundation, know the skeleton of it. You hear it on Sports Center every time the number one team takes on the underdog, right? It's David and Goliath. It's just well known. The basics of it at least are. But what does the Bible emphasize in this narrative? Okay, we know some of the story, but what is the Bible, why is it in here? Why is this story in here? Did God include this just merely to give us content for a locker room speech? Or to give you some courage against that addiction that you're facing? Or to say, man, this year's gonna be the year that I finally follow through on that New Year resolution, that I abandon every January 8th, is this gonna be the year, David and Goliath, my story? Is that why this is here? Well, let's walk through it. And we'll see. 1 Samuel 17. Now, the narrator recorded this in a way that builds tension. So we're not going to read the whole thing. We're going to read it in pieces and talk about it in pieces because you'll see why it's recorded the way it is, a piece at a time. So first, here it is, the setting. The first couple of verses show us the setting of the whole thing. Verses 1 through 3. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Azekah in Ephes Damim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in a line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. Now, you're going to see a map up on the screen here. It's maybe hard to see what's going on fully, but basically what you need to know is that the Philistines were making an incursion into the land of Israel. They were trying to take over. And so it ended up in this valley where the armies were camped on the either side of the valley. So if you don't know what that looks like, think of two stands at a football field where one team's on one side, their fans are all on this side, and it's on the other side, and there's a field between them. So that's kind of the picture. Philistines and Israelites on either side with a valley between. They can both see each other and they can see the battlefield. That's where we're at with the setting, which leads us to the challenge. This is the challenge. That setting is in your head. You've got the picture. Now watch the challenge get laid down by the Philistines. They were trying to overtake Israel. They opposed God. They opposed his people. Watch the challenge that's laid out here, verses 4 through 11. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Now, we have no idea what that is, right? It's roughly, let's say, about 9 feet, 9 to 9.5 feet tall. He had a helmet of bronze on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. Again, unfamiliar. It's about 125 pounds. And he had bronze armor on his legs and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, meaning a thick piece of wood. And his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. That's about 15 pounds. So his spear, just the head of it, weighed about 15 pounds. And his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves. Let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now let's just give them some credit. Do you see why they were dismayed here? That's why it's David and Goliath, the giant. He's this mass. Look at the picture of strength and power it gives us of this mountain of a man who has the latest military technology all over his body, in front of him, on him. He is the picture of worldly strength. But don't miss something critical here. See, Saul, and notice Goliath mentions him a couple times. Saul, as the king of Israel, he was the one charged with leading his people into battle, which means if the other side sent out a champion and a representative, it was his job to take that challenge, to accept the challenge on behalf of Israel. Yet what did verse 11 say? It specifically said, Saul and all Israel were greatly afraid. That's why in verse 12, we are immediately reintroduced really, to the person that throughout 1 Samuel plays the contrasting role to Saul. The one who was anointed back in chapter 16 as the king. We've already known his name. His name is David. Now, David is the youth referred to throughout this passage and really other passages. Remember David, the shepherd son of Jesse from the little town of Bethlehem? That was who David was. Here's where he enters into the story. Watch this. This is verses 12 down through 30, and it all fits together. Watch carefully as I read this. Now, verse 12 starts with now. That's meaning to contrast what just happened with what's here. Now, David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years, talking about his father. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle. The names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And for 40 days, going back to the scene, for 40 days, the Philistine came forward, took his stand morning and evening. And Jesse said to David, his son, take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain, a container, a bushel, and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of the 1,000. See if your brothers are well. Bring some token from them. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, took the provisions, and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, ran to the ranks, and went and greeted his brothers. And as he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines, spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. All the men of Israel, verse 24, all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who's come up? Like this is kind of the rumor going through the camp. Have you seen this man who's come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. And David said to the men who stood by him, because David just showed up. David hadn't heard much. What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine, takes away the reproach from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him the same way, so shall it be done to the man who kills him. Now Eliab, the oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, heard David say what he said. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, why have you come down? With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you've come down to see the battle. And David said, what have I done? Was it not but a word? He turned away from him toward another, spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. So you saw what was happening. David finally ends up at the battle. David hears what's going on. And apparently King Saul, instead of accepting the challenge from Goliath, he had instead tried to bribe a bunch of other people to say, hey, somebody's got to take this guy on. Why don't you do it? I'm going to give you all kinds of rewards if you would do it, right? Instead of saying, I'm going to do this myself. And what was the response? It was crickets, right? Nobody said, oh, yeah, I'll do it, right? Nobody did. They were all running and hiding. Yet this time, morning and evening, he kept showing up and challenging the people. This time, though, something, for the first time, we see a different response. David's there. He hears what this Goliath said. And what did he say in verse 26? Look again. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? See that? For the first time, a theological interpretation is introduced to this battle. Saul was supposed to have that. They were all, as Israel, supposed to have that kind of perspective. But only when David shows up for the first time, and as much as his older brothers were looking down on him because he was young, he just wanted to see the battle, he's just a little kid, David was the only one with enough sense to rightly understand what was happening here. Well, obviously, word would begin to spread that this youth, he had an edge that no one else seemed to have. Well, that news finally made it to Saul, to King Saul, actually. The one supposed to have courageous faith, which, by the way, that's why we put it in quotes here, because in no way at any point in this narrative does Saul act like a proper king of Israel. It's just, he doesn't show anything but a position. He was in the position, but he had no power of king of Israel. And we'll see it here. Look at verses 31 through 37. It says, when the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight, meaning I'll do it, go and fight the Philistine. And Saul said to David, you're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him. You're but a youth. He's been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Now, again, I've told you the contrast is the whole book of 1 Samuel between Saul and David. Here again, more and more we see the contrast. Saul heard David's speech and he's trying to quench David's faith. Now you can't do that. And David instead responds with how he killed lions and bears. He's like, I'm not scared of this thing. But notice again, it wasn't just David had this courage that none of us could have. David's heart was towards the Lord. Watch his perspective. That's so God-focused. He says, the Lord delivered me from those killer animals, and the same Lord will deliver me from Goliath too. It wasn't that David felt so confident in himself. It was like, look, the Lord did this there. Why wouldn't the Lord do this here? There's even further contrast. Look next, verses 38 through 40. Then Saul, as he says, okay, David, you're up. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor. And David tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these. I've not tested them. And so David took them off, and he took his staff in his hand, a long stick, and he chose 5 smooth stones from the brook, and he put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Now, it seems like In your head, you're thinking this little boy putting on armor. It probably wasn't that. David was probably a grown man in some form at this point. So it wasn't like it was too big. He'd never used it before. He didn't know how to use the military armor. But I want you to see this. Notice where Saul's mind went whenever David was about to go to the battle. Saul's mind first went to the same military technology that he saw on Goliath, or that he trusted in himself. He went to that everybody else trusts in when they go to a battle. Do you remember, though, how David had defeated the lion and the bear earlier in his life? Was it with swords and armor and all of the military technology? No. Now, as a shepherd, he probably would have had a staff, a long stick, and a club. That's most likely what he had, yes. But remember who he attributed victory to. He said it was the Lord who delivered him from those animals. David had trusted God to do that. Here, he trusted God to give the victory over Goliath. He didn't trust a sword or armor or anything like that. He trusted God would do it again. Just like he did it in the wilderness with those animals, he would do it again. And so see again the contrast. Instead of leading his people to trust Yahweh in battle, in life as he should, King Saul was just as afraid as anyone else, trusting the ways of the world and the things of the world like anybody else. But David went in the strength of the Lord alone. Saul was supposed to, David did it. And so as young David assumed the role of champion for Israel, and he moves onto the battlefield in this moment, think back to the description of Goliath, right? The giant, this mountain of a man, armed to the teeth, defended in every way possible that you can as a human. He is this huge figure, imposing, and here comes David. A stick in his hand, a sling in his hand, and 5 probably tennis ball-sized rocks in his pouch. But I want us to be careful here because we can get distracted really quickly by comparative size, military technology, whatever we think. Like we can just focus on that. There's a confrontation here. And as we watch this confrontation play out, we need to focus on the means employed to gain the victory. Not on anything that some painting might draw our mind to with David and Goliath. In this confrontation, Goliath and everyone else were trusting in one thing, while David was trusting something completely different. Look at this, verses 41 through 43. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you would come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Now, I want to stop there for a second. Because you see, Goliath brought a theological understanding to the battle as well. Back in this time, there was this understanding that military battles were competition between gods. And so Goliath, knowing he had a home field advantage, he was superior in every way, he knew his gods had no problem with this little youth. See, this wasn't just about swords and military technology here. This was a way for God to show off. This was a competition, in a way, between gods. And so the fact that Goliath also brought a theological interpretation here shows us that that's the root of this whole thing. And so while it may have appeared on the outside that David brought a knife to a gunfight here, watch David's true weapon show up here in verses 44 through 47. This is probably almost my favorite passage in the whole scripture. Watch this. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host to the Philistines this day, to the birds of the air, to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." Like, I don't know about you, but that makes me want to run through a wall or something. Like, that's just gets going right there, man. Like, that is so good. But did you see it? What was David's ultimate goal? It wasn't just to defeat Goliath, to defeat the Philistines, as necessary as that was. They defied God, yes. His purpose was that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. That's what he wanted. Like, that's just the same thing that God had told Abraham back in Genesis 12. He said, "All the families of the earth shall be blessed through you." It's in fact what Psalm 96 records. It says we are to declare his glory among the nations, his marvelous works among all the peoples. For great is the Lord and greatly to be praised. He is to be feared above all gods. For all the gods of the peoples are worthless idols, but the Lord made the heavens. See the comparison again, right? See, in God's economy, there's always an evangelistic drive. That God is not just content to have a few people in a little country in the Middle East know who he is and know him well. His heart, purpose from the very beginning that David's heart was for, it's something that we need to understand. His heart is that his glory is declared to the ends of the earth. He's worthy of it. He is the God above all other gods, but also because anything else people live for is going to be unsatisfying. It's worthless. Any other God people choose to walk forward to, whether it's a figurine or whether it's an idol of materialism or whatever else we live for, whatever else we put as supreme in our lives, relationships, kids, whatever it is, we put that in front. It's always going to be less than. It'll never satisfy. Nothing less than a relationship with Yahweh will satisfy us. That's why his glory needs to be declared, because there's nothing else to live for that's going to actually fill what we're looking for. And he's worthy of it. That was David's heart. That's why God rejected Saul. That's why he chose David. It's because David's heart was right towards the glory of God shining to the ends of the earth. David wasn't being arrogant or prideful in any of this. He was just humbly confident in his supreme God that nothing can prevent God's glory from shining brightly to the world. David just said, I want to be a part of that. There's nothing else to live for. I want to be a part of that, which finally gets us to the actual battle. Like we've been for 47 verses, just leading up to the actual battle itself. And it really only takes 2 verses. Because again, the narrator was focused not on military strategy, he was focused on theological interpretation of this. The difference between a God who cannot save and the God who does save. Look at verses 48 and 49. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell on his face to the ground. This is the victory that God gave to David. This is the victory. Only one of the 5 stones, we don't know why he picked 5, but one stone is all it took, slung perfectly into the only vulnerable spot on Goliath's armor, right between his eyes. Here's the thing though, most likely that didn't kill him. Definitely stunned him, because look at this Mortal Kombat-like finish him scene in verses 50 through 54. Watch this. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. But look at what 51 says. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Sha'arim as far as Gath and Ekron. That's all that area to the west that we saw on the map. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines. They plundered their camp, and David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. This was the victory that God gave to David, which is what David said was going to happen. Remember in his speech to the Philistine, to the Goliath, he said, I'm going to cut your head off. What'd he do? He won the battle. This day the Lord brought victory. Now there's actually one more scene here in chapter 17, and I believe this is to be a setup for the rest of the book, actually. Look at verses 55 through 58 quickly with me, and we'll come back to the story. But this is the contrast, again, between Saul and David. Watch this. As soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of his army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, well, as your soul is, I don't know. And the king said, inquire who this son the boy is. And as soon as David returned from striking down the Philistine, Abner took him, brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I'm the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. Now, if you remember a couple weeks ago, I said that I believe, I wouldn't die on this hill, but I think the narrator flipped 17 and 16 chronologically. That David and Goliath was actually the first thing that happened chronologically in the story, but then 16 happened afterwards. But why did he do that? Because Saul doesn't seem to even know who the guy is, like this David, but in 16 it says he's serving Saul. So how does this work out? It seems like the narrator flipped it because what he wanted to separate was God's election of David in chapter 16 from his military skills in chapter 17. In other words, God did not pick David because he was a champion warrior. He picked David because David was a man after God's own heart, and he wanted God's purpose in the world over everything else. And that's all going to come up again and again as we go through the rest of the book. Keep that in your mind as we go into it. Now, that's one of the most fun narratives in all of Scripture, right? Like David and Goliath, we love that story, but here's the typical question then we ask as a result of it. Okay, what do we do with it? What do we do with that? And I've heard varying interpretations of what we do with this. I've heard teachers and songwriters speak about facing the giants in your life with courage because this little boy was able to defeat giant with a sling and a stone. And you can do that too, right? We're like Dave with the giant pickle. Remember that? Like little people can do big things too, right? That was the whole point of that. But then I've also heard other teachers swing wildly the other way and scream at people saying, "You're not David," and go after them as if they're wrong and saying, "This is only about Jesus and sin, and that's it." Right? Okay, well, in some way they're both wrong, I think, but also kind of both right. So what do we do with this? Because it's true that since Jesus interpreted the Old Testament as talking ultimately about him, the primary truth we do need to remember in this is that Jesus did defeat the biggest giant we face. Like, we need to remember that Jesus defeated the biggest giant for us. Because Jesus is referred to as the Son of David so often, we look at David as a type of Christ who's pointing us forward to the things that Jesus would do perfectly, which means that all of 1 Samuel 17, in that story, you are not David. I am not David in that story. You and I are Saul and the rest of Israel hiding in the bushes because we're terrified of that giant called sin. And we can't defeat it. And so we needed a champion to come in and rescue us, to win a representative battle for us so that we could be free. He would overcome that sin through his life, death, and resurrection, that we could never defeat that enemy ourselves. That's ultimately what this is about, yes. That you and I, as sinners hiding, scared, defeated, you and I can receive the victory of Jesus as we believe in faith that he's won the battle for us. Yes, that is absolutely part of what this is about. And most importantly, that's what it's about. But it doesn't only point us forward to Jesus as our champion. See, listen, Romans 15:4 talks about everything happening to Israel as written for our instruction, both what to do and what not to do. It was part of why it was recorded. That means as we examine how everyone in this narrative responded to the giant problem they faced, that means we can learn that God fights through those who trust him. We can believe that. We can believe that God does fight through those who trust him. It doesn't mean we go pick fights with the enemy and we go try to find Satan so that we can pick a fight. No, it just means we know how to stand firm when our enemy tries to challenge God and tries to challenge his people. It means that we don't trust the world's means for victory. We trust God for victory. It means that we are willing to be used if God wants to use even us to do something like this. It means God works and fights through those who trust him. And listen, in your life, in my life, it might not look as drastic as cutting off the head of Goliath, but you can trust that when you believe in God and you believe in his power, that he is winning battles in your life. You can trust him, you can obey him, and you can believe that he is going to do what he wants to do, and he's going to win battles. He's working to shine his glory even brighter through those who trust him, through those who obey him, so that all the world may know who God is. You can trust it, you can believe it, you can follow him in it. But there's an even deeper layer to all this as well. And I think it's really subtle here in chapter 17, but I think it's really important for us to understand to even get to that level of belief and trust in God. Each of us need to stop and consider, what story am I listening to? What story am I listening to? Ask yourself that. Here's what I mean. You remember early in this narrative, all we heard were the claims of the Philistines. They were saying, hey, this is a battle between your army and our army. And look at how big our champion is. Look at how strong he is. Look at his military might. Look at how weak you guys are compared to who he is. Look at how powerful he is. And how did Saul and his army respond? They were dismayed, greatly afraid. They were listening, hear this, they were listening to the story of the world. They were listening to the story of the Philistines, the story of the enemy, the story of their own flesh, instead of listening to the story that God had told them. Instead of believing what God had already said. Remember, he said he would deliver them. Do you remember? He said he was going to win battles for them. He said he was going to bless them. They forgot that and they listened to that story in front of them. Listen, it reminds me of Numbers 13. Moses sent 12 spies into the promised land to scout it out, to check it out, see how great it is so that they can know how they're going to move forward. They all saw, when those 12 went into the land, they all saw the same thing. They saw giants, they saw fortified cities, they saw everything in front of them that they then had a choice, whether they were going to believe what they saw that was scary or they were going to believe what God had said and done. You remember? God had promised the land. They had no doubt if they really believed that God had promised it, all was in front of them. They also had seen God deliver them from Egypt, split the sea wide open, defeat enemies left and right the whole time. They had every reason to trust. They could know that God was going to deliver them, and only 2 of them did. 2 of the 12 believed God. Is that not the same thing that's happening here in Isaiah in 1 Samuel 17? Saul and Israel, they allowed the Philistine story to shape their views of what was happening, that it was about strength and power and military might instead of remembering who God is. But David saw the same giant, heard the same story, but instead of hiding or bribing other people to try to take over, he believed in God's glory more than anything else. Listen, is that not a daily struggle for us as well? Is that not the same thing we face? How are we listening to the wrong stories? How are we listening to falsehoods? How are we not listening to truth? Because there are competing narratives all around us every single day. And you know what I'm talking about. Things like, well, this is how you win at life. This will satisfy you. You need to do this to be fulfilled. You need to do this so you can win. And all of those things, or even the narratives that you hear that, man, you could never overcome that. You're weak. God doesn't care about you. Or whatever other story you or your flesh gets tossed, that enemy throws it in your mind and you think about that. Listen, how are you choosing instead to listen to the story of God? Like to the reality of this God who has no competitors to his throne, the God who cannot be defeated, the God who has already overcome the world, the God whose glory will shine to the ends of the earth, this same God who fills you with his power, the same God who has a good plan for your life when you trust him and obey him, this God who works through those who trust him, this God who's not afraid of a puny little giant. That is the true story we need to listen to over and over and over again. Listen, that's why we soak in his word. So that we can listen to his story that defines everything else. And so we can trust him more no matter what we face. That's also why we do the Lord's Supper. Listen, we trust God's sovereignty. We did not plan like this for this sermon, but it works. To where the Lord's Supper pictures a story of victory. It shows us that Jesus' life, death, and resurrection is enough to bring the victory for you and for me. And man, we forget that. We doubt it. I was bad this week. Probably gone too far. Whatever it is, right? We've done these things and we doubt. This story is what we need to be listening to.